All right, welcome to the Moynihan Report here on the 2A Network. I'm your host, Michael Moynihan. Today, we are joined by Josh Citarella. And by the way, I just want to say on the prompter, it's spelled out. I know how to pronounce Citarella. I appreciate that you, like phonetically. Who's an artist, internet culture writer, meme lord. He's been elevated to lord status. And the creator of the video podcast that I have been consuming in the past couple of weeks, and I got to say you should too, called Doomscroll. Josh, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Congratulations on the new channel.
Oh, thank you very much. And you know, it is our goal to get people from all sort of walks of life, and I've in all political backgrounds. I don't really understand your politics. We're going to get to that in a second, because I mean, you're a keen observer of politics, and you talk to young people about sort of extremism and their kind of path to extreme politics. Tell me a little bit though about your background. An artist for a number of years. What do you consider yourself now? I mean, do you still say I'm an artist if you're identified?
I mean, my day-to-day is that I write and I podcast, but in the last year I've shown in more museum shows than I have at any other point. It doesn't feel like the thing that I wake up and do every day. So I'm still very, I mean, mostly now it's a circuit of European group shows and the pieces move from one museum to another, and I'm very hands-off. I don't have much in my studio. So I still have a presence in universities and MFA programs and cultural institutions, but my day-to-day is that I do commentary and I talk about media theory.
Tell me about this a little bit. I mean, what is it for people who are unaware of your work and your podcast? And as I said, you should go check it out. It's very good. What is it that you focus on? What is it that you're studying? I mean, there's a lot of political polarization and extremism, right?
Yeah, I think the best way to start is really at the beginning of this story. So in 2018, I self-published an ethnography of a mimetic subculture. This was called Politogram in the Post-Left, and it was looking at that time, teenagers who were ages 12 to 17 that were posting radical memes from across the political spectrum. Yeah, literally 12 years old.
Wow.
Have you not seen a 12-year-old anarcho-capitalist post? That is some funny shit. I didn't believe it myself until I would see them like post a selfie on the bus to school. You know, one of the pivotal moments in my practice, I was watching a 12-year-old anarcho-capitalist debate a 13-year-old neoconservative, and I was like, something is fucking going on here. This is really interesting.
I mean, neoconservatism I thought was dead. Apparently it's revived amongst 13. It's just happening in the middle schools of America now.
It was a
the Norman Podhoretz's
short-lived movement. They were not thriving at that moment. I think largely speaking, if you're looking at a generational lens, that libertarianism and neoconservatism are waning in popularity. A lot of the Gen Z right is this kind of heterodox economic populist.
100%. I mean, I grew up politically in libertarian world. I never, for a variety of reasons that would take probably a couple of shows to explain, I never identify as a libertarian. But I have some instincts in the libertarian direction. But yeah, no, it is a lonely place, particularly for people who say, you know, Donald Trump saying, you know, we should tell the drug companies what the drug should cost. So this was a couple days ago, right?
Yeah, this is
a government saying, a government setting prices. A Republican, you're like, wow, this is not what I was expecting. And there's not really a lot of pushback from Republicans on this. So the landscape has changed. But tell me why you would even bother, and I don't mean this to be an obnoxious question, but like 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds, 14-year-olds, God, I mean, I probably identified as a syndicalist or something when I was that. But you go through these moments. What is it that's interesting about young people's attraction in trying to find that identity and finding it in, you know, extreme places? Because people notice that. It's like you remember the kid at school who was incredibly boring, and he went home for the summer and came back with a mohawk and like a GBH t-shirt on. And I was like, oh, he's a punk rock kid now. Like kids do that, right? I mean, politically, what is it that interests you about that?
I mean, I literally did an interview where a kid turned into a national syndicalist over the summer, so I know exactly what you're talking about. But I mean, for me, like the cleavage that was really interesting, this is between the 16 and 2020 arc, which was that There was, I think we got to approach this through three factors, which is that there's the attention economy that privileges sensationalism and outrage and hyperbolic, exaggerated politics.
Yeah.
And then there's just the way that children engage with ideas, which is kind of comedic and shitposty and so on.
Yeah.
But then there was the real political crisis and the expansion of the Overton window that was not related to either of those two things. And you saw an enormous expansion to the left and to the right with the Sanders campaign and the Trump campaign.
Yeah.
And, lo and behold, here we are in 2025, and the neoliberal order that has been intact since like 1971 or 72 has been overturned. So my temptation is to say that these teenagers who are talking about these large-scale 20th century philosophical debates were actually correct, and the experts that were telling us that the center was going to hold, they were wrong. And so there was an important thread to follow among the young people there, that they were actually onto something, that this Fukuyama thesis about the end of history, 1989, Cold War is over, liberal democracy is the final form of human governance, that thesis has now been overturned. Something else is happening. What is happening, we don't yet know. But the kids had spotted that early on while the experts had not.
Oh, God, there's about 1,000 follow-ups here. But I will say a couple of things. 2020 was obviously a breaking point for a lot of people, too. Is that, traditional forms of, neoliberalism, however you want to define that. I know you had a guest recently trying to define neoliberalism. I always just think of it as just free market capitalism in a lot of ways, in a global sense, globalization. But then 2020 happens, and you see so many people on the left, and I'm going to say on your side of the ledger, you're obviously a man of the left, kind of rebelling against the infusion of identity politics into this in a way that I think and a lot of people thought was pretty corrosive and pretty disruptive. So the two of those things kind of are at the same time competing. The left is, certain elements of it are abandoning this stuff and saying, I don't know if this is, and the American public is kind of abandoning it too and electing Donald Trump for a second time. So where are we now? Because I don't think the sort of neoliberal order is going away. I think there's a lot of conversation about it. There's sort of tariffy conversation, but then the markets respond and the government pulls back, or the Trump administration pulls back. People like their stuff. They like being theoretical about it, but they like doing it on their iPhones that don't cost $4,000. So where do you think we are now politically, and particularly through the lens of all these young people that you see online and in discords and on all this place?
Yeah, I mean, you got to be careful, because if you uncork the libertarian Excel spreadsheet portion of my brain, this is going to be a long podcast. I mean, I love
time limited,
neoliberalism. It's a fascinating subject. The only thing I would say, what you mentioned earlier, is that I think you can't really abandon identity politics if you never embraced it in the first point.
Yeah, that's
the corner of the left that I'm in, this kind of old left social democratic constituency, we were never really advocates of that stuff. But in reference to neoliberalism, there's, I think, a distinction we can make of like the period roughly 1980 to 2020, which is a historical period of imposing austerity and privatization and things like this. But then there's a longer history of neoliberalism as a political philosophy, which begins in the 1930s. And I would argue that we are very much still within the framework, the international framework of neoliberalism, but the particular period of retreat from the market, not having a state interventionist hand in the economy, like those things have kind of been overturned. I think that there's a competitive dynamic, particularly between the United States and China, in which we're watching the reshoring of industry. We're bringing back our manufacturing capacity. And we're safeguarding technology in a protectionist measure, which is, pretty unusual if you roll the clock back 10 years. So
you as a man, again, pretty firmly on the left, and your roots are on the left. When you see, take away the oafishness of Donald Trump and some of the people in his orbit, right? There are, from what I can kind of guess from what you're saying, there are some policy elements of this that you think are pretty good and a good redirection for, hey, if it's the Republican Party, great. I wish the Democratic Party would go the same way. Is that kind of how you think about it? I asked Bernie Sanders about this one time in the first Trump administration, and I said, Bernie, he sounds like you when he's talking about trade. And his response to me, he said, Michael, he's lying. And that was like, I'm being honest, he's lying. And it's like, but yeah, there's a lot of overlap when you see, you can't be upset that a Republican Party these days is sounding pretty lefty on economics on a lot of issues, or abandoning the sort of Cato Institute,
right,
AEI type of economics, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you would call this new political order, if we can phrase it, that sounds a little grandiose, but whether it's mercantilism or classical liberalism or who knows what, but there are certainly elements that do not match this kind of free market evangelism that we've seen basically for my entire life.
Yeah.
I think what is most interesting is that the Trump measures, particularly in reference to tariffs, seem rather incoherent about how they're going to be implemented. There are people on the left who are very much in favor of that. I would say Dustin Guastella wrote about this in The Nation. The UAW has also been advocates of tariffs.
For sure, yeah.
I don't think that there is any future in which a world of the 21st century superpower competition is not going to employ some type of tariffs to protect domestic manufacturing. But doing that without any kind of industrial policy, I don't understand how that's going to work. And there are practical considerations of like, there are certain resources that we cannot obtain in the US. Like rare earth minerals are where they're located because of geology. If you're going to put a flat tariff on all of that, like how are we going to get iron ore? How are we going to get like columbite? All of these things that we need like physically in the production of chips and capacitors. I don't necessarily know if there's a lot of clear guiding philosophy on some of these Trump tariffs. I think
it's an interesting point because I mean there's such a schizophrenic attitude from the White House is that if you want to reshore manufacturing, if you want to bring factories back to the United States, which in some cases I think is probably a really, really bad idea, but this is a 20, 30, 40-year plan. And every day it's like 145%, 50%, 75%. This uncertainty the markets don't appreciate, and companies don't want to move based on that. What are your politics?
Yeah. I'm an old school social democrat. I want to ask you before I lose track of this about why bringing manufacturing back is bad. I think it's an interesting.
No. I don't think. I mean, American manufacturing is at its highest capacity of all time. Literally in history, but we produce a lot more stuff with a lot fewer people. So if you bring manufacturing back, the idea that it's going to be a bunch of people with wrenches in a factory is not true. I mean, there's going to be a lot of people with computers. I've been to car manufacturers. I went to the plant for Volkswagen in Tennessee, in Indiana.
For automation.
There's just an automation thing is that we do a lot of manufacturing here, but I think that there's a kind of romantic idea of what manufacturing is. And it's not what it was in the past. And it's also, even if those jobs of the past were available today, I'm not sure many people would want them because we've been accustomed to a certain lifestyle. Like, I mean, in a factory is a tough thing. And, particularly with, talking about the UAW. And who did I interviewed one of this union guy recently. We were having this very same conversation and argument. But bringing that stuff back is just, to me, always a bit of a fantasy about the way industrial policy is going to work. Having an industrial policy to say, we need to actually reshore stuff. Well, what stuff do we have to reshore? Making an iPhone. Donald Trump said a million times, we're going to make an iPhone in the United States. It's impossible to make an iPhone in the United States. You're going to assemble.
To India, aren't
they? Well, exactly. That's you get around the tariffs. I mean, companies are clever. But, you can assemble things in the United States. But as you point out, all of that material has to be sourced from somewhere else. And if there's a tariff on every one, those prices go up pretty high. I have mixed feelings about it. But I think the idea that a number of people I talk to, I can't say this across the board, is that there's a romantic idea of manufacturing. We're not going to go back to the 50s. And there is a lot of automation. We should not fight AI. We should try to figure out how we're living with these things and say, in 1910, there were movements against the tractor because there were 20 people that used to sow the field. And now there is one guy and a tractor. So, you can't stand athwart progress yelling stop. I mean, you can say, well, maybe we should think about this in a certain way. But I think the kind of this agrarian utopian idea is probably not going to happen. That's kind of my position. But your politics these days, you're a social democrat. How do you?
Can I try to tie a few of these things together? Because I think, that's what I appreciate about your program is that you do think about these things carefully. And the school of thought that I
try.
come from, I'm going to try and tie a bunch of things together here. That's why I was making a
Yeah,
note
yeah,
for myself.
yeah.
So coming from a
writing me a
background
ticket
of the
or
left, being interested in media theory and like kind of fringe politics like
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
accelerationism,
Yeah.
I was very inspired by the ideas of Nick Zernick and Alex Williams, who wrote a book called Inventing the Future. There's a school of writers, including Mark Fisher, a bunch of these guys who are looking at the kind of the failures of left politics post 2008 and trying to propose some type of alternative. I asked Nick Zernick on a podcast about reshoring. I think this was back in like 2020 or 2021, and he said essentially what you just said. And when I detect a narrative that's on the left and on the right, that probably means it's true. I think there's a reasonable consideration that bringing back manufacturing and the higher labor cost in the first world, that creates the incentive for producers to automate, to save in their labor costs.
Yeah,
so I think that's a very serious consideration. But I think at that point, when we talk about reshoring or friendshoring, as they're calling it now, right, under the military umbrella of the United States, that some people get preferential tariffs and maybe they make our stuff and Americans are the consumers. I think that's plausible, but there is kind of a right and left version of this where people on the left will argue for reshoring because they want a robust middle class for the material well-being of workers and so on, and all of these arguments we're familiar with. I think there's a nationalist argument, which is actually right now, as we speak, kind of the guiding impetus behind this.
Oh, for sure.
Which is that, if we are reliant on China to produce our green energy and our chips, and then our gray war turns into a hot war, all of a sudden we lose our energy capacity.
Yeah.
And so I think that level of state investment, you see it as an expenditure on the basis of national security, which may indirectly have like the military Keynesianism effect that raises living standards or wages for workers, but that's not what they're trying to do. That's not what's
it's not what they're trying to do, and they're unfortunately using that phrase, national security, because that's how you get around Congress, right?
Oh, that's the best one.
Yeah, because Congress is
get rid of civil liberties.
Yes, all these. Congress is given the power to tax and to levy tariffs, and obviously the president's doing this because it's a national security issue. I do believe is a chip manufacturer being in Taiwan. Right, Taiwan's invaded, and like all of a sudden, good Lord, we're that I agree with.
Yeah,
I don't believe it's a national security issue to get lumber from Canada. That's how. I mean, this stuff is all phrased as a national security issue, or we're being invaded by illegals from the South, so therefore we can use various clever legal tricks because we're in the middle of an invasion. We're in the middle of a national security crisis.
Sure,
There's all this stuff that is pushing this stuff. I just don't know. This is the interesting thing for people on both the political left and the populist right of how popular this stuff is going to be when people have gotten accustomed to having things that are cheap, to having what they want. I mean, Donald Trump sounded like a Maoist when he said,
he did,
you have too many dolls.
The right are now Maoist third worldists.
It is unbelievable to me.
And their memes of Americans in like the sweatshops.
It's
so
the Chinese
hilarious.
ones are amazing. I've seen you posted some of these things. Like, I know you've talked, and I've listened to a bunch of your interviews with the people on the left, like young people on the left, and I find them utterly fascinating. What do you find when you look at the right now? That was the scare for so many people. I worked at Vice for a number of years, and you could not open the website without someone saying, everyone's being red-pilled, and don't let your kids become Nazis online.
Right.
They're all going to be Nick Fuentes. When you look at the young people on the kind of internet right, what do you see these days? Is there a sort of rise particularly in racism, because you see a lot more of it now on X. All the filters are gone. You see like a lot of anti-Semitism. It's pretty crazy.
Yeah.
And what is it that you see amongst these people as a kind of dominant theme?
I mean, this is. I'll try and make this as concise an answer
it's
as
a big
possible.
question.
So I wrote about the rise of TikTok in December of 2018 for a publication called Artsy, which primarily focused on art, but I was familiar with that platform because of my social media research at that time. This article went, it had a much larger audience than I had initially anticipated because TikTok all of a sudden shot up to #1 on the App Store. Yeah. Paul Joseph Watson, previously the correspondent for InfoWars, took my article in a video called The Cultural Significance of TikTok that I think it has something like 1.2, 1.3 million views on YouTube. Large portions, like a few minutes of that video, is just him reading my article.
And he's the guy from Alex Jones's InfoWars.
Yeah, he's independent now.
But he was at that point.
Yeah. And that prompted me to write this piece called Irony, Politics, and Gen Z, which lays out, I think, first this politicization theory that in combination with the progressive media landscape, the synergies between big platforms and the Obama administration and general progressive hegemony in culture and media, that young people who wanted to have countercultural politics would, at the early stages, lean towards the right. So that was my first observation.
Just a quick thing, which is really interesting to hear you say these days. In the early 2000s, there was a book by a Nation columnist, correspondent, named Eric Altman. You probably remember Eric Altman. He wrote a book called What Liberal Media? And there was an idea back in the day that we would argue against this idea of liberal media. It was a fever dream of people on the right. What you're saying is, the institutions are pretty much progressive. They are, of the left, and this is having an effect on young people. Is that?
I would not say of the left.
They
are
indeed
progressive.
I would say the Democratic Party. How about
progressive neoliberalism?
Yeah,
third way.
So
Democrats,
not of the left as you were describing.
Kind of Clintonite constituency playwrights. Yeah. I think that's inarguable. You know, and I think that people who try to maintain that there's like an objective position of mainstream media are like they're clearly losing ground. I mean, Trump won the fucking popular vote. Let's be honest.
Yeah, that was.
So but I mean, in reference to this initial thread of the Gen Z conservatives, what I watched at that period and what is discussed in the 2018 book was this transformation that was called the libertarian to alt-right pipeline. That was the label that was given to it at the time, which was a slow political evolution of people who were very anti-hierarchical, perhaps didn't believe in the legitimacy of the nation state. They wanted some anarcho-capitalist libertarian homesteading utopia. And then over the course of a few years, they drifted towards these very protectionist, isolationist measures and embraced this kind of mixed economic model. So that trend, I would say, has been pretty consistent. It also tracks with a larger evolution of American political ideology, where if you look at someone like Peter Thiel, for example, who is much more among this like tech libertarian exitarian politics around like 2011 or 12, Balaji Srinivasan of this like this movement to try and like escape the constraints of nation states, to have like private city states.
And these are Silicon Valley. A lot of them are Silicon Valley.
This was a big current. This was like really influential at that time. And then, lo and behold, I think it's 2020 where Thiel is one of the speakers at the National Conservative Conference, and you're like,
he was a speaker at the RNC in 2016.
How did we flip? Like, what happened here? What happened to the way that the right understands the role of the state? And for me, the only expedient way of explaining this is that China was stealing their IP, and they realized that they needed the might of the American military and its economic power to actually protect their intellectual property and their profits. And so you see an embrace of the entity of the nation state among the right, which kind of explains how you get from techno-libertarianism to national conservatism within the space of a decade. I think that's basically what is tracked with young people on the right.
And all of a sudden, we're in the last line of 1984 that we all love Big Brother, right? we all love the state at the end of this.
We're all statists now.
We're all statists now. I mean, it was, was it Nathan Glazer said we're all multiculturalists now, and now we're all statists. I mean, is there any room left, or do you see a place for, that kind of old conservatism, which cared about tax cuts, which was a little more libertarian? I mean, by the way, this was libertarian in name only, or in sort of speech only. People weren't actually going and cutting the Defense Department budget. That was not happening. But they were saying they said they wanted to cut everything but that.
Right.
But to go back to that time, because people say, look, you go into America, and the populist message is one that is really appealing. And why would it not be, right? I've seen this thing, and I presume you have, this meme on the right, this is what they've taken from you. So they show a photo of like some idyllic 1950s thing that looks horrible to me. But they're like, who is they? Who is they? I think it's the Jews, by the way. They is always the Jews.
To be clear.
It's like, this is what they've taken from you.
Right.
And it's this nostalgia that I used to see a lot in the left, and the kind of far left. And everyone was always looking for their Spanish Civil War moment where they could go and fight on behalf of the cause in a foreign country and be kind of globalist in that sense. But I see this on the right now of a nostalgia for a time that I don't think really existed. And so I don't see a place where the kind of libertarian ideas, the free market types, the neoconservative stuff specifically on foreign policy, like is that dead? Because you said a neoconservative 13-year-old. Do you see amongst young people any kind of revivification of any of these ideas that are kind of off the table now in mainstream conservative politics?
Free market ideas.
Yeah, free market stuff. Even interventionist foreign policy too.
I would say that would constitute, I would say, the mainstream position in maybe my generation. But for Gen Z and younger kids, they are kind of on the receiving end of a lot of the market failures and the corruption and the immense concentration of wealth. So they're very skeptical of markets as a means to provision society with resources. They speak, I think, very critically about like Ayn Rand. They speak critically about Reagan. Those policies really just do not resonate with them. They are libertarian in that they enjoy their free speech, indeed, because they say all sorts of like grotesque things on Twitter, but they're really anti-free markets. I think that's the most coherent.
Isn't it also true? Yeah, no, I mean that does strike me as true, but isn't it also true, just to give a little kind of slight off-ramp here, that you see a lot of polling amongst Gen Z people that they are not huge fans of free speech. That there is an idea that speeches can be dangerous and should be controlled in certain ways. And those numbers have gone from basically nothing to sort of up here, and people agreeing with those sentiments. I mean, one of the interviews I heard you do with a young radical, and he was talking about these Tumblr communities and all of the identities that were being created, and they were printing flags like making this stuff up and trying to protect them. And all of that instinct seems to be kind of antithetical to the idea of free speech, and you see that in the numbers. I mean, in poll numbers, do you see a lot of that says, we have too much freedom? Like, I mean, I have actually seen people basically say that.
Yeah, I mean, I like to say this is that we're dying of liberty. I think that in reference to the Gen Z on left and right about how they feel about free speech, I think it has always been a kind of tacit precautionary measure in that when any particular regime is in power, it's like, well, people want free speech for them, but not for their political opponent.
We're seeing that now.
And so because we can't, consistently hold on to power, we both mutually decide to preserve free speech for both parties. But I think there's generally a confusion that we have now about the ability to convert free speech into political change, because arguably social media just opened the floodgates about who could say what and gave everybody a voice. And I think that we've seen, basically since the mass adoption curve of 2012, a pretty consistent narrowing of the political possibilities up until the doors just kind of bust open with Trump in 2025. And we see this kind of radical policy shift. So yeah, generally, I think there was maybe an earlier generation that really prized free speech as like the mechanism, essentially like protesting in the public square and holding signs. But we've seen you look at the protests against the war in Iraq, you look at Occupy Wall Street, you look at the Women's March and the anti-Trump protests, and then the George Floyd uprisings. Like each of these is quantitatively larger than the one that came before it. So at what point do we start to question the efficacy of free speech itself when everybody is out in the street making a protest? Like, is that actually converting into political change?
Yeah, maybe the efficacy of protest itself.
Well, I think protest is kind of the furthest realization of free speech.
Yeah. And of course the Gaza protests are probably bigger than the George Floyd.
They're probably larger than
they're probably larger than all that.
And whatever comes next will be even larger still. And
So how did we get to Donald Trump coming back? I mean, there was so much, and I think the internet is a great, you can read the tea leaves of this stuff, but if you look,
banned him.
I mean, they banned, and he won. They banned him from everything. They banned him from Twitter, and they banned him from Facebook.
They deplatformed him, and then the fucking people who banned him show up to the inauguration like, I'm sorry, please, sir, can I have some?
Yeah, I mean, by the way, this was the first moment that I was like, maybe I'm like Citarella, maybe I'm some crazy leftist here. There's like these titans of industry now groveling at like literally at, I was like, Jesus Christ. Right. At the inauguration, these people who facilitated his banning in so many ways, which of course had no effect. I mean, it probably had the opposite effect. Same thing of true with Tish James and some of these prosecutions that they overdrew. Some were more sensible than others, but like lawfare probably doesn't work with people. But if you look at Donald Trump this time right after COVID, where the economy is humming along, unemployment is low. I mean, compare American unemployment to Spanish unemployment, for instance. And you can argue about whether they're good jobs or not, but it's low unemployment. You know, people have 2 cars, people living a pretty nice life. It's not the 19th century. It's not like a Dickensian. And they say, we've had enough of this. We are done with this. And maybe it's Joe Biden and people not acknowledging that he's, you know, dying in office. Maybe it's immigration, people seeing that stuff. I mean, Shane Gillis, the comedian, had a very funny joke about how his father was railing about immigrants, and he's in Western Pennsylvania and he's never seen an immigrant. He's like, they're so obsessed with this stuff. But what do you think it was amongst people, and particularly amongst young people? You see a ton. You go to the inauguration, you go to these things, there is a enormous young MAGA movement, like, which is so surprising to me. It just seems like an old person movement to me, but there's a lot of very, very excitable, active young people. What is it in 2024, in your estimation, particularly from looking at all this stuff on the internet and people, that says we need this change again? We need to go back to this and try it again.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this is it's an uncomfortable topic for people on the left because a lot of the economic indicators at the end of the Biden administration were actually looking quite good.
Yeah, they're pretty good.
Yeah, and it's tough for people to admit that, but I think the most coherent explanation, I did kind of a media circuit around the election and talked to a lot of people trying to gauge like what is a story that can actually explain this, right? I think if you correct every incumbent election across basically the advanced world, US and Europe, for dissatisfaction based on the inflationary effects that a lot of the COVID policies had early on, that those margins explain a portion of it, but not enough of it. So
I just want to point out that you do sound very free market and not like a Keynesian there, because you're just acknowledging that spending lots of money from the government does create inflation. But go ahead.
We're no, I'm not denying that. But we'll do a whole arc later about central planning, Walmart, and Amazon, and Google.
Oh no, you're not. We're not going to central plan. I'll be in the fucking gulag just as long as you give me a pass out. But continue.
I take market forces seriously. I think that not having those discussions is detrimental to the left because you sound incoherent. So there was an inflationary effect. The left was hesitant to admit this. Also, topics like crime. There was just a real kind of disastrous messaging around 2020 that was hurting the wallets and the everyday experience of normal people. I think the only way that I can explain the shift towards Trump is that the positive effects, the economic effects from the Biden administration were they were too little too late. You know, like they were indeed happening, but most people had not yet felt them. It takes time to adjust to those narratives. The abrupt shift to Kamala Harris, who was not democratically appointed by anybody, who was just kind of like tapped to be the next king or something like that. Just objectively
a bad candidate. I mean, she's not a great candidate.
Dropped out in 2019.
She did before her own state, before a primary in California, she dropped out. It was like, this is not the person that you want.
She is Brad, though. We have to admit that.
Which is something that I'll never understand and never try to understand. But I mean, that was, in a way, I wonder if that had any frustration for young Democrats, not people on the left, but young Democrats.
Oh, yeah.
That, you know, let's be perfectly honest, this was an identity play. The reason she was picked as vice president, the administration was completely open about. And that's fine, if you want to say that. And then there was the conversation amongst people that I know in the kind of Democratic establishment is that it's going to look very bad for us to bypass the first black female vice president. And this is kind of her birthright. We should just get in but if you look at this objectively, she's just not a great candidate. She's a terrible speaker. She's not a good debater. And to do that, to keep within those kind of confines of what is essentially an identity politics way of looking at choosing or the coronation of a candidate, gave us Donald Trump again.
Well, I think the problem with that view is that the most important margins we're looking at is that of young people, young men shifted 15 points towards the Republicans, and young women, I believe, shifted 11 points.
Yeah.
So there's a gender dynamic, but there's primarily an age dynamic.
In a race dynamic,
within
too.
a margin that large, there must be, ostensibly, people who voted for Joe Biden in 2020 and then voted for Trump in 2024. Yes. So what were the things that convinced them? We also have to take into account that historically, this is the largest multiracial coalition of black, brown, basically every demographic except white boomers shifted historically towards the Republicans. So something about this worldview is just not sitting with most people. And this is a pretty big problem for the Democratic consultants who keep running these candidates.
So what is the lesson for the left here? I mean, what is the lesson from the left who told us for so many years? And this is, I've always said, I want to be on the left. But, I grew up in Massachusetts. I grew up listening to hardcore. I grew up I wanted to be I'm not Screwdriver. I was not the Nazi stuff. And the left was so good at alienating me at every point. And one of the things that drove me crazy was, particularly through 2020 and that period, was the number of people that thought Hispanic was a thing, that Latinx was a thing.
Latinx.
Whatever. That's not that's a thing, that there's no differentiation between a Nicaraguan voter in Miami.
Yeah, I think 98% of the people that label applies to don't know what it is.
They don't know what it is, number one. And number two, the shift was so enormous amongst Hispanics because the presumption amongst white liberals was that, they came across the border at one point. They want everyone. No, I did a documentary about this in Texas, the most Hispanic county in America, Stark County, in the Rio Grande Valley, and everyone was like, they shifted to Trump by 40 points. They voted for Hillary. It's insane.
47% of Latino men voted for Trump. Those are the polls from 2024.
Go to Amherst. Go to Berkeley, and before the election, and ask any academics, any chin-stroking person there, if that would happen, and they'd say, no, this is a racist party that does not have the interests of the working class, and particularly the Hispanic and black working class, and they start talking about, black women will save America, et cetera. And that just not only wasn't the case, it was so dramatically wrong that I wonder if there's a moment, in the same way the Republican Party, I wouldn't say the conservative movement, but the Republican Party looked at itself in 2016, 2020 and said, oh, Jeb Bush, David Frum, these types of people, that's not our future. This is not what we have to retool. And even now, with Donald Trump, the death of Donald Trump, the physical death of Donald Trump, is not going to be the death of MAGA in any way. It's very embedded into it. They know that is where the conservative... Is there something about 2024, even 2020, defund the police, all these things that really scared people, that has jarred... the left, I know that's not the best term. Democrats, liberals, progressives, leftists, that said, this thing that we've been doing for so long, that really comes out of the universities, is just a loser with the American people.
I agree with all of that, actually.
Do you really? Oh, okay,
yeah. This is not. Yeah. I am of a corner of the left that says there has been an elite institutional capture that started in the '68 generation, and that a lot of this rhetoric just does not represent anything that has to do with the lineage, the scaffolding of philosophical, theoretical thought that calls itself the left.
Is that mostly because race and identity overwhelm class as a general point?
In a very kind of brief summary, yes, but it has to do with the professional interests of academics and the route towards upward mobility within their institutions. I did an episode with Vivek Chibber, who is the editor of Catalyst Journal, the host of the Confronting Capitalism podcast, and he gives us, we do an hour-and-a-half history on this very topic. So I largely agree with that. One of the things that I wanted to bring up, though, is this sense that you mentioned before of kind of countercultural, subcultural affiliation being part of the left. I loved your episode with Thomas and talking about that Vice era, because I really think that is actually that's a very important thing in how it relates to now.
Yeah.
Like the phenomena of a right-wing counterculture is kind of unimaginable to my generation.
Yes.
But that is literally what we're experiencing now.
Yes.
And so I think trying to explain how that thing happened, you really have to go back quite a long ways. What is the left to do? What is the appropriate response for that? My corner of the left is something that looks much more like the 1930s. I think that we're going to be living in an era where it's not inconceivable to me that there are things that are analogous to company towns like West Virginia coal mines, but instead we have Amazon fulfillment centers. And so I think the type of organization, the kind of robust trade unionism that characterized that period is the only clear path forward for any of this.
Yeah, I mean, I hope when you say the 30s, you're not saying you're a Stalinist or something. I'm assuming that you're
I'm not.
like a trot or something. No. But no, I think
I'm thinking of the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World of that period.
You're a little wobbly. That's fine.
Yeah.
And I mean that as the wobbly is not you're a little wobbly. The Vice thing is interesting because to me, and I wrote about this, last year. I wrote a long piece about this and my experience at Vice over a very, very long period of time. And the politicization of Vice was a great example of the kind of corporate media magazine, formerly magazine version of the way Democratic politicians treated Hispanics. They're with us. People, they love us. They love this stuff. They'll never, our identity politics are exactly what they want. They want open borders, et cetera. The Vice version was being convinced because of elite institutions that this was the content that people wanted, and they didn't. Nobody wanted it. They wanted, excuse if you have kids around, like the donkey fucking piece. Like honestly, that was one of the biggest pieces of Vice for a long time. Thomas Morton's stuff getting knocked out in Chile or getting punched in Chile. Like all of that stuff, the fun, irreverent, that felt like a little dangerous in not coming home after work, turning the TV on and having someone yell at you. Someone scold you.
Right.
This is what your people that you don't even feel a part of are doing and doing wrong, and you should atone for it. Like that's not entertainment for people, but there was a sense because of what was happening in the universities that this is, and corporate culture too. Like after George Floyd, ever put a black square up and filter the stuff by black-owned businesses. That just felt very alien to people, and they're like, yeah, I don't like that. And I think the same thing was true at Vice and a lot of media stuff. It was like you're giving us things that you think that eat your vegetables, not what we want necessarily. And I think particularly amongst working class people, that was like there was a real negative reaction to that.
I mean, I would say that this is not only a media question because it's also now a political question.
Yeah.
Because so much of our political discourse is litigated over social media. Essentially what we're talking about here is what is the role of institutional editors and gatekeepers, and what is the role of market inputs determining what people want, right? And so I'm more inclined to agree that a market mechanism to keep institutional gatekeepers accountable is pretty important. Otherwise, we get wildly unpopular decisions and we have elites who are totally out of step with average people. They just don't want to see this stuff. They don't buy tickets to movies, for example. The flip side of that is that we have overcorrected so far that if there's no one who's telling us to eat our vegetables, we're going to choose Snicker bars all day. And what you get in the kind of media aggregation of social media, it's just vertical videos on TikTok and slop. It's AI slop. And that is what most people choose. So I think we're now kind of in this awkward position, especially for people on the left whose rhetoric, basically they've been trained their entire adult lives to try and like dismantle power. But we have to now make these arguments for what gatekeepers and institutions did. What is a functional model of that? Because I would say that largely what we're seeing on the proliferation of like vertical videos on TikTok, like this is not satisfactory culture. I would much more prefer a magazine-like structure, what you're talking about, and having this audience accountability rather than just total horizontality and the kind of like chaos of the online social media landscape. And I'm involved in some projects that are doing that. I'm a big proponent of building new institutions. I think that editors and curators are important. I think that if you extrapolate this out a bit further, we're going to zoom out quite a bit here. The background, the kind of intellectual debates that I was involved in for 2010 up until now, 10, 15 years of these conversations, is that the kind of apex example of this is a stateless market economy versus the institutional entity of the nation state. And why I brought up this kind of exitarian, libertarian city-state project before is because within the framework of neoliberalism, especially someone who is committed to social democracy, that project, beginning from the 1930s onward, has sought to create an economic patchwork to facilitate capital flight, to drain social democratic states of their resources. And so to me, the political polarity that we're seeing emerge now, which is, I think, most interesting with the emergence of this nationalist right, is that there was a general trend towards this neoliberal model of globalization and stateless capital, that it would be all supported by these international frameworks of private property, and that the nation state, by comparison, would be subject to privatization and would ultimately wither away. A lot of these, are you familiar with there's a technology called WorldCoin? Is this?
Yeah, I've heard of it. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. I'll give if the audience isn't familiar, but my peer group, we argued very early on around 2015, there's an important book by Benjamin Bratton called The Stack, that the emergence of platforms as a method of social organization was as important and as significant as the emergence of nation states. So as far back as 1644 with the Treaty of Westphalia, this 30-year trade dispute between the Dutch and the Germans, states were described as two-dimensional lines on a map, and that's where the thing existed and did not. What starts to happen with the emergence of platforms is that you get non-contiguous sovereignties, non-contiguous entities that are transnational and that are as economically large or larger than most nation states. There's a famous example of this in 2009 where I believe Honduras accidentally invades Nicaragua because they set their military patrols on Google Maps, and there was a clerical error on behalf of Google Maps that put the line 2.1 miles deeper into the territory. So the important thing I think to look at is that we're watching this emergence of a new form of social organization. That's why I brought up Balaji Srinivasan before, because the network state is kind of the end point of this trajectory of neoliberalism. So a product like WorldCoin, which is a technology by Sam Altman, who's the founder of OpenAI, it's a silver bowling ball. I had a Zoom call with a friend of mine who works in Silicon Valley, and there's a little black hole in the middle of it. And you look into this thing, and it scans your retina, right? So that is a unspoofable form of identification that is biologically linked to each individual. Even identical twins will not have the same retina scan. Attached to that biological marker is a wallet, and that wallet can serve different transactions and identities and payments between people in a completely blockchain-based stateless infrastructure, open ledger, and so on. So if you look at the emergence of these things, like the conventional roles of the nation state as it emerged in the 20th century is cartography, currency, and identity. Platforms have now begun to fulfill all of those things. And so I think we really need to take those things seriously if you are from the social democratic persuasion that I need the existence of the nation state to fulfill the welfare state, to set floors for labor law, and to enforce contracts and property and all of those things. So that framework, I think, is where we necessarily need to expand this conversation. And it begins in this very kind of early, strange conversation around media theory of the role of editors and gatekeepers. When do we say no to markets? When are the negative externalities or the failures of markets more detrimental to society than the constraints of institutions?
Yeah, sometimes I worry about who makes those decisions, but what a failure.
I do too, yeah.
All right, we're going to take some. Do you have some questions, Jason, from... let's grab somebody from the audience who has a question for Comrade Citarella, Tovarish Citarella.
Where? Which one should I look at? This one? Is that okay?
Elisa,
Hi.
how are you doing? Do you have a question for our Marxist friend, social democratic friend?
I am a Marxist. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I was born in USSR, so perfect. But I am going to ask you about a topic beaten to death, but freedom of speech campuses, Harvard and Columbia. I'm Israeli as well, so that hits kind of hard. And I was wondering, if you were the president of Harvard or Columbia, how would you address that?
It's a very good question.
I think there's any number of things I've said on the internet that would ensure I never get that job. So this is an interesting moment to be having these conversations. I would say that and I'll try to answer this in a way where I don't get deported overnight. So one of the things that I think may have paved the way for the type of free speech policing right now is that there was a very censorious element on the left that was basically left unchecked for 8 years. And I wonder if some of the policing on campus, removing people of their civil liberties and throwing them out of the country, silencing their political speech, if that would have gone over so easily if we hadn't laid that groundwork before. I have a difficulty imagining myself as being in charge of any kind of elite institution like that. I've been in enough rooms with enough wealthy, influential people where I inevitably say the wrong thing and piss them off. So, I wound up podcasting for a reason.
That's usually where we end up.
Yeah.
But I mean, when you see things like the, occupations of libraries, kind of holding people, holding a janitor hostage overnight, they're breaking of windows, defacing stuff. I mean, that is a different level of protest, of campus protest. I mean, what is your general reaction to that? I mean, do you think that is a productive thing for the left to be involved in, or certain elements of the campus left to be involved in? I think it's a lot of nostalgia for maybe the Weather Underground or something, and the 1968 generation. You always get that amongst people who are like, "This is our moment."
Yeah. I'm very critical of the Weather Underground. I don't find that to be inspirational or productive in any way. You mentioned Nathan Glazer before. I think a peer of his, Daniel Bell, made these arguments around the protests in Colombia, maybe in the late 60s, early 70s, that this is, again, one of these kind of institution or gatekeeperless questions, in that the liberal values that are upheld, the Enlightenment values of those institutions, are the things that allow you to protest in the first place. And so I think a lot of these calls from the extreme radical left to kind of, people will literally say to dismantle the institutions and to grow mushrooms and farms in their stead. They want to use the property for something else. I think that's gravely mistaken. The efficacy of
certain buildings at Columbia I could see being mushroom farms and being more useful.
I think that would be a poor use of resources. I think institutions are important. I would say that the efficacy of these protests has not been very effective, but I am fully on their moral side and believe in what they're protesting.
All right, I'm going to do something that we, in the other job that I have, the Fifth Column podcast, we call a French goodbye, which is, asking a very complicated question as the last question. So I'm going to give you 30 seconds for this, because we have this is the challenge. You can meet this challenge. If you look at the past 100 years, 150 years, where do you see kind of your ideas and the things that you believe are the best kind of way forward for humanity being implemented in a way that was effective?
I'm long on states. I think that states are necessary to compose society, to have productive capacity to be economically competitive in the 21st century. So I think that we've seen a massive overcorrection towards markets in the neoliberal period, and we are again realizing the importance of the state. That does not mean that there are no market mechanisms, but there is I think, general convergence moving away from the Cold War dichotomy of socialism versus capitalism towards this new model that resembles something more like what China is doing now with these 5.5% growth rates. I see that as being a kind of inevitability of the development of states in the 21st century.
So in 30 seconds, we got from Comrade Citarella just acknowledging at the end of the show
it might not be good.
Chinese
it might
communism
not be good.
and maybe even Maoism.
No, it's not communism. It's state-directed capitalism.
It's state-directed capitalism.
And they're doing neoliberalism better than the Americans right now. That's the great irony. Milton Friedman said this.
You heard it here. He's a big proponent of Chinese communism. All right. Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us.
Michael, thank you.
It was interesting and fun, and we like having all sorts of different views. And if you have stuff you want to chime in about, send us a mail, go over to the, we have a Substack sort of thing. I don't know. I don't even know what we have anymore. We got to sign up at the thing, right? The YouTube channel. I'm just trying to figure, it's on the screen. It's at the Moynihan Report. Go over. We're new and I'm old. But leave the comments and subscribe and everything. But we'll be back next week on Tuesday with another phenomenal, fascinating, interesting guest. So be sure to tune in 7 p.m. on Tuesday, and we'll see you then.